Thank you all for coming. I'm Curtis Paxton, Director of Utilities for the City of Vacaville, and we are very happy to host this third workshop on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and its implementation. I'd like to first introduce two other people that work with me at the City of Vacaville. We have Justin Cole, the Assistant Director of Utilities, and Bonnie Robinson. Looks like this is just like church. You got to get here early to get the seats in the back. But we're happy to have you all here, and it's be a very informative and hopefully educational process for you. Our goals for tonight, as you can see on the screen, update you on the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, in our local area, give you background on SGMA and how groundwater works. And the real important part is answer questions you may have. Some of those answers may be, we don't know at this time, but we are definitely going to take all the questions down and get input from you on SGMA and the groundwater sustainable agencies and the groundwater sustainable plan that's being developed. And lastly, give you a chance to meet those of us who are working on the SGMA issues here in the Solano Subbasin. We do have one director from Reclamation District 2068, Dale Crosley. Thank you for being in attendance, Dale. I'll go through a quick rundown on some of the staff who will be supporting us here at this meeting. First off will be our facilitator from Ag Innovations, Joseph McIntyre. He is supported also by Susanna Sossman, and who's out at the front table. Vicki Kretzinger from Ludorf and Scalmanini will be doing the technical presentation. And Christopher Lee from Solano County Water Agency, on behalf of the Solano Subbasin, will be talking about SGMA. So once again, we appreciate you all being here tonight, and hopefully it will be an informative and educational process for you. Joseph?
Thank you. Why don't you go ahead and click to the next slide for me. Thanks. Thank you for coming. I appreciate you taking the time away from your family and an evening to come out and help us think about, talk about, and understand the opportunity to manage our groundwater for the benefit of people who are living here today and in coming generations. My name's Joseph McIntyre. I'm with a small nonprofit organization that's based just one county over in Sonoma County called Ag Innovations. And we specialize in one thing, which is creating meaningful and robust dialogue between agriculture, conservation, communities about how we can preserve and protect a future that we all want to have. So our role today is to hope have a good meeting together, to create an environment where we can get some good questions from you, and open the door to what will be a much longer process of actually engaging you around some of the specific things that come up in developing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So in terms of our agenda tonight, we're built around three short presentations. And the goal in each of these presentations is to give you the information that you need to kind of understand how to plug in, because today is the first of 6, including this meeting, opportunities to jump in and talk about how this plan is going to actually come together in the Solano Subbasin, which is a, we'll just define for you, but which is a little bit beyond the county boundaries and doesn't include everywhere in the county. So what is the law? What's it about? We're going to use the term SGMA. So if we say that, we're meaning the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is a collection of a number of bills that were passed several years ago that in its totality drive our requirements to build a groundwater sustainability plan. We're going to talk to you about where we are about this plan right now in the Solano Subbasin. So the people here supporting you are all part of the technical process to actually write a groundwater sustainability plan. And we'll tell you what that is, but I'll tell you right now it's nothing more than what the name says. How do we make sure that the sustainable use of groundwater that we have today is maintained in the future? Simple as that. We're also going to spend a little bit of time and start to take you into some of the hydrology of this area. What does that mean? Fancy word, hydrology, combination of water and geology. Where does the water flow and how does it flow? So those are our three topics. After each one of those topics, we'll have a little bit of Q&A, and we'll give an opportunity to kind of dig in. We're a small group, so there's plenty of time for us to get your questions answered. And as Curtis said, in some cases, the answer is we don't know yet, and that'll be the best we can do tonight. Forgive me, I don't know, whoever, speaking of things, there's something about being behind a lectern that's always made me more nervous than standing out here, so forgive me if it's distracting. It's just a habit of me. We don't have a whole lot of ground rules tonight. This is just us here. This is your community. We are tonight, though, going to stay focused on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation in our area. I know that water management and issues in a county like this, which is close to the Delta, close to urban areas, are much more complex than just groundwater. But tonight, we're just going to focus on the Sustainable Groundwater Implementation Act. And the only other thing I'd say, too, is we'd like to have as many questions from as many corners as we can, and we're not looking for agreement tonight. So let's be respectful, but tell us what you're thinking, and that'll help us out. Does that sound good to everybody? It should be, like I said, an informative and I hope valuable evening to enable you to engage as we move forward. So, ready to start? I think we're ready to go. I want to thank you all again for coming and taking time out from your home and your families to be with us and enjoy. I want to invite up to the microphone and the podium Vicki Krutzinger. Vicki is our senior engineering resource on the development of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. She's from a firm called Lurov and Scalmanini Consulting Engineers, and she'll talk to you a little bit about the law, and then a little bit later she'll also share a little bit about hydrology. And we're so lucky to have you, Vicki.
Thank you, Joseph.
Want that? No, I
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming and spending part of your evening with us here. But before we dive into highlights of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, I just want to touch on what is groundwater. So it's something that's one of the most important natural resources in the state and in the world. It's something that we don't necessarily think about every day. We use it, we rely on it, it's related to our livelihoods, it's related to how the community does. Very important. So one of the things that we're trying to show here is, there's subsurface materials beneath our feet, the heavy rains that we've had since last fall, where the ground is permeable and where that water that falls on the ground can migrate into the subsurface, wander through airs and pore spaces and sands and gravels and silts and clays. It eventually goes to saturated material in the subsurface, and that's what we're talking about when we refer to groundwater. And we're going to come back to this, as Joseph said, in more detail later on, but everything about this act relates to groundwater. So there's also other terms, basins. So when we refer to a basin, that means the materials that I just spoke of, the sands and gravels, clays and silts, those that you see in the Central Valley floor are an example of where there's a basin, and the basin is defined by lower permeability materials that surround those other sands, rocks, sands, gravels, clays, silts materials. So the things that are less permeable hard rock, the mountains to our west and the Sierra Nevadas to our east, those are the things that bound the basin. So even the entire Central Valley is really one groundwater basin, and then there are also subdivisions of the basins, simply referred to as subbasins, and those can be either physical features that create those subdivisions, but more often they are political or institutional geographic boundaries that make them convenient to refer to them as subbasins. And in California, there are, at current count, 531 of these basins and subbasins. And where we are, that Joseph mentioned, is in the Solano subbasin, here within the Central Valley. And off to the left here in this image, we're showing a blow-up of the subbasin area. And Chris is going to talk in more detail about the groundwater sustainability agencies, which many of you are represented by here tonight. And we're all within one larger basin that is within the Central Valley called the Sacramento Valley Groundwater Basin. So in California, we use a lot of water. In 2005 to 2010, the California Department of Water Resources did an updated California Water Supply Plan, the California Water Plan update. And at that time, they computed about 43 million acre-feet of total water use in the state. And that water use includes surface water, groundwater, and recycled water. And when we refer to an acre-foot, if you can imagine a football field, that's about an acre-foot, and then 1 foot of water spread across that football field, and multiply that by 43 million times. That's a lot of water that we use. And of that, about 40% in a normal precipitation year is about 40% groundwater. And in the drier years, like we had a few years ago, and even in 2018, 60% or more of the water use is groundwater. And it depends on where you are in the state. So these other bars on this image, they show the relative proportion of surface water in the lighter blue bar, and then the amount of groundwater use in the darker blue bar. So on average, in the Sacramento region, for instance, it's about 30% use of groundwater. Now that varies locally, as you may individually know that there's some areas in the Solano subbasin that are only using surface water, or they're only using groundwater. In the Vacaville area, they're using both surface water and groundwater, and there are a lot of areas within the Solano subbasin that use both resources. And this is very important because this was due to the foresight of those that have been, working and planning for water supplies and reliable water supplies in this area for decades, and recognizing that the use of surface water and groundwater together, the conjunctive use of these resources, is extremely important to the sustainability of the resource. And that is not the case in other areas in the state, particularly when you see the news stories of the San Joaquin Valley and all the issues that that part of the state is dealing with. So water management in California is a complicated story, and I'm going to try and make a long story short. So it wasn't until recently that California even had groundwater regulations on a statewide basis, and that was when the act was adopted. Before that, there was legislation that related to studies that were done to understand groundwater in the state. There was legislation in 1992, and then after that, up until 2014, legislation that resulted in voluntary groundwater management plans. But those voluntary plans didn't require reporting. They didn't require quantitative measures of how to know that we were sustainable. So it wasn't until 2014 when we were in much of the height of the drought at that point, and critical drought conditions, and legislation that came about and resulted in the enactment of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in September 2014. So with that, it became a different sort of scenario with more requirements, more reporting. But the other thing that occurred, and was really a hallmark of this legislation, that a core piece was saying it's up to the local entities, the local stakeholders, to put together this groundwater sustainability plan that the Act requires, and later regulations came about in August 2016 to detail the content of these plans. But it is basically saying that it's up to the local people to determine how they're going to ensure or maintain sustainability, or if you're not already sustainable, that you will become sustainable. So these regulations that came about after the Act and were adopted in August 2016, there are about 41 pages of regulations that describe what needs to be in these plans. So they're very complex, and we're going to touch on just a little bit of that as we go along. We're waiting for images here.
Why don't you keep going? We'll get the power up, right?
So one of the things that the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requires is the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies. Chris Lee is going to talk in detail about what's going on locally, but it's those agencies that ensure that the plan gets developed and that it's compliant with all these regulations, and that it becomes, that you ensure sustainability. Sure. That's all right. It's a good time when there's no images.
Ask several questions.
Yeah.
Question about subbasins. Are you talking about the area? Because all of us are on the Tehama Aquifer, aren't we? That's what I've been told in the past.
Right. So we're going to.
How that relates to subbasin? What do you mean by subbasin?
Okay. So the subbasin is the aerial extent of the deposits that are referred to as alluvium. So those are loose deposits of sand, gravel, silts, clays. And so the depth of those deposits that are unconsolidated, semi-consolidated, they allow water to be transmitted through them. In the case of the subbasin, they're not bounded by low permeability rocks on all sides. They are on one of the sides to the west of the subbasin area. So the formations that we'll refer to later, they're when we start to refer to the aquifer system, the groundwater system that includes not only all of the saturated materials, but when we refer to an aquifer, then it's referring to formations that can be developed for beneficial use through wells and such. So we'll come back to that.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Because I think I want to make technical terms. California has a huge groundwater basin. It's called the Central Valley. Think about it, right? It's a gigantic bathtub. The Solano subbasin is a subbasin of that huge, gigantic groundwater basin, which we know are called the Sacramento Valley and the San Joaquin Valley, and that you live right at the intersection of, which we call the Delta. But water moves all around through that, and we understand through some of our studies that maybe some of the water that actually gets here originates as far away as Chico. But for the purposes of doing this act, we've broken the state down into what are called subbasins. Now, the subbasins aren't necessarily it's not like there's a wall between them and water doesn't go from one to the other. That's really important to know. They're interconnected. But they do match up a little bit to what we understand hydrological realities are, and most importantly, they match up to the geopolitical boundaries like the cities and the counties. Why? because for SGMA to work, it actually has to end up affecting how we drill wells or how we share water, how we move things around. And that's stuff that you do here in this county. So the sub-basin is broken out of this bigger groundwater basin so that we actually can do the work. Within the sub-basin, you're so right, most of the shallow wells are in that top level of what you call the Tehama formation. So two different concepts. One's a hydrological concept and the other is sort of a geological one. That's a political one. That's sub-basin. Sorry, is that helpful?
Sub-basin really is referred to something that our representatives in the government use to define the area of our county. But what you're saying is the water is actually in the Tehama aquifer, but at different depths. It's because of the soil?
We'll come back to that, yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Back to that one in the hydrology one.
Yeah.
That was a really good question. Did we answer that? Did that make sense, the difference between the groundwater basin and the sub-basin for folks? Okay, good. I'll take that.
So now that we have a slide back, one of the things I wanted to follow up on, if the local entities are unable to come together to have the plan developed and submitted to the Department of Water Resources, then the Act provides for the State Water Resources Control Board to come in as a backstop. And so one way or another, the state wants to ensure that the basins become sustainable. All right. Now we seem to be...
Turn it off. This is informal tonight, folks. That's a solution. I'll like my advice on.
No.
Becky, you got it? I think it goes up. There we go. That's on. And now we just do it. We have Wow, you know what we've done? This is our third one.
Did that work?
It's supposed to work now, but we didn't have
Is the battery dead?
Can you do it from the laptop?
Yeah.
Because I could just do that.
I can try.
There we go.
Okay, now it's working. All right. So one of the things that is in the Act is that some of the basins, some of the 531 basins are not required to develop a groundwater sustainability plan. And it's based on a prioritization of all these basins. That occurred first in January 2015. And now there's been some reprioritization. But essentially, the prioritization is into 4 categories, either very low, low, medium, or high. And there's also other basins that you may have seen in the news that are in the category of critically overdrafted. Those are high priority, but they're also another level up in terms of problems, critically overdrafted basins. So those are on an accelerated timeline to do plans. These rankings are based on a number of factors. So it's the population, it's the number of wells in the area, it's the amount of groundwater use, it's many things all together that result in a score. And then that score reflects the importance of groundwater in the basin. So you can be a medium prioritization, which is what the Solano Subbasin currently is. It's undergoing a reprioritization, which I'll explain in a second. You can also be a high priority basin, and it doesn't mean that's a problem necessarily. It just means that groundwater use and groundwater in that area, in that basin, is really important, and it's really important to have it be sustainable. So in the Solano Subbasin, the initial ranking was medium, and because there was a recent boundary modifications of some of these adjustments to these boundaries that we were just talking about, where they're geographical or political and other reasons that have come up, entities can apply to the Department of Water Resources, ask for boundary modification at certain points in time. One of those just occurred, and when that happens, then there can be a reprioritization process, and it may change the ranking of the subbasin. So on the agencies, I touched on this when we had a blank slide, but essentially Chris is going to talk in more detail about it, but it's really important for the local entities to come together, the groundwater sustainability agencies, because they're the ones that, like yourselves, that are going to provide input to what's important in this plan. There's some things we're going to talk about later in this presentation and other presentations that are important to have that local input, and then ultimately that plan to be approved locally and submitted to the Department of Water Resources. So there's a timeline, and many timelines, but this is at a high level, and the key ones are shown here. So one of those is the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies. That's already come and gone. That was June 2017. Did that, check the box, then we move on, and now we're into the process of developing the groundwater sustainability plan. Part of that plan involves outreach and engagement with the local community. There are other things that I'm going to touch on a little bit later in this presentation about what's actually contained in this plan. And that plan is due January 31st, 2022 to the Department of Water Resources. After these plans are submitted, then there's another timeline 20 years out that says you need to either become sustainable if you're not sustainable already, or you're going to want to maintain the sustainability that's already been achieved. So in these plans that we've started to work on, and we've categorized components, even though there's 41 pages of regulations and all the detail of what needs to go in these plans, we've kind of boiled it down to 4 main categories. One is to describe the information about basin conditions. So that means what is the geologic setting? What kind of formations are in the area? Where do we produce water from? What is the hydrology? What are the water supplies that are important in the basin? How are they used? What is the outlook, into the future about the availability of those supplies? Another is defining basin sustainability. This means that there are a number of quantitative measures to track sustainability, and I'm going to touch on that in a future slide about some of the terms related to these measures. So it's defining what is sustainability in the eyes of the local stakeholders. What does that mean? It also means how we try to track it and ensure that it's occurring. Another is the development of projects and management actions. This means if we're sustainable now, then what are we going to do to maintain that sustainability? It could mean doing a lot more of what we've always been doing, or it could mean identifying more things that we also want to do, such as a popular thing in agricultural areas in particular is looking at opportunities to capture excess stormwater and put that stormwater where it can be percolated into the subsurface, and it can provide additional recharge and a buffer, particularly in drought conditions. And then lastly, to prepare the plan, and as we do that, we're not planning to provide a draft plan all at once, all at the end, and say, here it is, and now review it and comment on it. Rather, we're planning to provide that in pieces so that it can be reviewed, looked at, questions asked, comments made, and there can be input to us as we go along in preparing the entire plan. Sustainable yield, this is an very important term. It's an integral part of the Act. It means overall collecting the data and synthesizing that data so that there's an understanding of the maximum amount of groundwater that can be withdrawn over a very long period, many years, and how that can occur without causing any undesirable results. Now, that's a term in the Act that means basically we don't want to cause adverse effects on a number of key indicators. a couple of terms related to defining quantitative measures to ensure sustainability. This is essentially like taking the health of the groundwater system. We want to be able to measure what's going on in the subsurface and how the use of groundwater relates to ensuring that there aren't adverse effects by the use of groundwater. So the terms are minimum threshold. That means setting a measure below which we don't want to go. Otherwise, we think that that is going to be defined as contributing to an undesirable result or adverse effect. The other is called a measurable objective. That means something that we're targeting to achieve or fluctuating between what's the minimum threshold and the measurable objective. So what we're showing here in this graphic is a measuring stick as an example, and it means for the groundwater levels, we go along, we have different kinds of water years, dry years, wet years. What we don't want to do is go below this minimum threshold, otherwise there might be things such as land subsidence or depletion of groundwater supply, those sorts of things. What we want to do is keep our water levels going between these two measures that we've established. We're going to keep coming back to these terms, so this is just the first introduction to introduce you to some terms that are important to this act. These undesirable results, there are 6 key indicators, they're sustainability indicators, and these include those things that we're trying not to make worse or create significant and unreasonable adverse effects by lowering groundwater levels too much, taking too much groundwater out of the subsurface, creating saltwater intrusion in some basins. This is more important in terms of what that means. Water quality degradation, it can mean many things depending upon where you're located. Land subsidence, over-extracting in a certain area and creating a compaction of the Earth's surface materials and potentially damaging infrastructure or other things. And then another very important one is the depletion of surface water. So pumping so much that the interconnectedness between surface water and groundwater causes a reduction in the surface water. And then lastly, just to sum up, we had those 4 categories of things related to the development of the plan. And at a high level, our time frame, we started back last fall, and we're in the mode of developing geologic, hydrologic information, and we're in the process of gathering a lot of data from all the entities, and we're putting together the information to help us develop a preliminary water budget. And that's one of the things that we'd be coming back in probably the next workshop to discuss in more detail. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Vicki. So let's swap mics around a little bit. Maybe you could use the black one, and I can grab this one. So I want to open up for some questions just about the law, just the backgrounds. We're going to, in the next presentation, we'll talk more about what's happening specifically here. But if you have some questions about the law itself, how we got here, why we're even doing this, this is a good point for that.
Haven't there been some groundwater basins along the coast that have been regulated already?
You want to take one, Chris? So, he asked, haven't there been groundwater basins along the coast that have been regulated already?
Yes, the answer is correct, yeah. So unfortunately, as Vicki mentioned, we have some critically overdrafted basins, and a lot of those actually are along the coast and southern part of California and southern part of the San Joaquin Valley.
There are also adjudicated basins that have gone through very lengthy legal processes, sometimes tens of years, in order to determine how to allocate water.
Other questions? So let me have this one back. I'll make a little public PSA, and then we'll go into our next piece. So one of the things that the law requires and I can't underscore this enough, the law requires that that the development of this groundwater sustainability plan include robust public engagement that touches every stakeholder that is concerned about groundwater in this subbasin. So this is the beginning of that process, and I wanted to point you to a couple of things that would be really helpful for us as you work on, as you listen to things tonight. We have 2 surveys on the table here for you. The yellow one is just gives us a little bit of sense of your groundwater concerns and issues, and where, kind of gives us a picture, a glimpse into the way that you are thinking and want to involve yourself. The second one is about how we can reach you and what's the best way to have these kinds of meetings. If you want to hear from us, if you want to keep finding out what goes on next from this, please let us know by joining our mailing list. The easiest way to do that is to make sure that we have your email address on the sign-in sheets that you have outside. But if you can also provide that information here. But do let us know how best to be in touch with you. And if you take the time to finish these during the meeting here tonight, there's places to drop them off right here in the back of the room. These surveys also are available online, or they will be shortly. They're already up online on the Groundwater Sustainability Plan website, where also you can get copies of the presentation. So with that, I want to turn it over to Chris Lee. Chris has been leading us all in trying to get this project underway here in the Solano Subbasin. It's all yours, Chris.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, this one's fine. So as was mentioned earlier, my name is Chris Lee, not Christopher. I work for the Solano County Water Agency, but I also represent the Solano Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And I do apologize, you're going to be hearing a few more acronyms and abbreviations from me. You've already heard a few from Vicki. You're going to hear a few more from Vicki here shortly. The 2 that I'm going to be using most tonight are Groundwater Sustainability Agency, or GSA. These are the agencies that are charged with developing the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or GSP. Now, when we first started these discussions back in early 2015, the boundaries of the Solano Subbasin were much different than what we see today. As you can see, there was a large portion of it actually in Yolo County. There still is actually a large portion of it in Sacramento County. And it was a much smaller group that first started these initial discussions. City of Vacaville, Solano Irrigation District, Solano County Water Agency, and the Dixon Resource Conservation District. And one of the things that we heard early on is that we need to be more inclusive, talk to other agencies, other entities that have more direct representation from landowners. And we heard that loud and clear. And you can see the list of all the parties that we invited to discuss this. We had a few drop out: City of Fairfield, Travis Air Force Base, North Delta Water Agency. They felt that the amount of groundwater they used, or the actual footprint they had in the subbasin, wasn't that big, so they stepped aside and kind of let the others lead the way. Also, about halfway through the process, Yolo County did what was called a basin boundary modification, and Vicki touched on that earlier. And so what they did is they asked the Department of Water Resources to take this portion of the Solano subbasin that was in Yolo County and actually move it into the larger groundwater basin they have in Yolo County. They were working on 4 at the time. They were successful in their endeavor and made 1 large groundwater basin in Solano County. The Sacramento GSA did a much more modest basin boundary modification, and that's the one Vicki was talking about here, where they looked at removing a small island in the Tracy subbasin and actually moving it into the Solano subbasin. Sacramento County is also dealing with 4 groundwater basins. They're keeping them kind of separate for different reasons. One of the things that we had tried to do early on is, as we were talking amongst ourselves, was to see if we could work work together to develop a single groundwater sustainability agency that could develop a single groundwater sustainability plan for the Solano Subbasin. Didn't quite work out. We had a number of entities and agencies that have never worked out together, and so it didn't quite work out, but what we ended up with were 5 GSAs, 5 groundwater sustainability agencies, which actually will work. This is quite fine, and this is actually fairly common up and down the state. In fact, it's actually going to be quite rare when you see a single groundwater sustainability agency looking towards developing a single groundwater sustainability plan. And so we have the changes to the map you can see here. We've removed, for the most, Yolo County out of the subbasin. We do actually have a few little areas here where we have Reclamation District 2068, where Director Crosley manages some of the land out there for the district boundaries, and also for the Dixon Resource Conservation District. They are also in Yolo County. So Yolo County was very accommodating, and these agencies didn't want to be part of 2 groundwater sustainability plans. So when Yolo was doing their basin boundary modification, they allowed us to add these areas into Yolo County so that those agencies could be in a single plan. So of the 5 GSAs, we have 3 that are single entity GSAs. The City of Vacaville, our host tonight, Sacramento County GSA, and Solano Irrigation District GSA. And then we have 2 GSAs that are multiple entity GSAs. So the Northern Delta GSA, they're located down here. They were formed through a joint powers agreement, and this is a group of 18 reclamation districts that are out in the Delta, 8 of which are actually within the Solano Subbasin. And then the Solano GSA, the largest portion here, represents about 60% of the subbasin, which I'm staffed to. Also a multiple entity GSA, also formed through a joint powers agreement. And for the most part, covered by 2 supervisoral districts, Districts 4 and 5, which represents the largest agricultural interests in the subbasin. And again, because early on we had heard that we need to be inclusive to entities and agencies that have landowners on boards that represent the interests and potential concerns coming forward. We invited the Solano Resource Conservation District, the Dixon Resource Conservation District, the City of Dixon, City of Rio Vista is part of this, Reclamation District 2068. And again, because we heard early on we need to include more that represent landowners, through an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, we invited other agencies that were otherwise not eligible to be part of this process to be part of this process. So we invited, we have Director Russ Lester with us tonight. He represents the Solano Ag Advisory Committee, so we invited them to be part of this process. We invited the Solano County Farm Bureau and a few others. And so we think what we've done is a good start at representing landowners, the irrigators, the farmers, the ranchers that are going to be part of this plan as we move forward, that will be policymakers. They're going to be at the table making the decisions. But again, this is going to be a stakeholder-driven process, but even at the higher level, we have a good mix of landowners that are going to be making some of the policy as we move forward. So Vicki touched on this a little bit. Again, GSAs, groundwater sustainability agencies, they are the ones that are required to develop the groundwater sustainability plan. And again, I just want to point out here, a GSA under SGMA, really, you have to either be a water manager or a land use authority agency to be eligible. But because we formed a few of these GSAs through joint powers agreements, we were able to invite others, again, to try to be more inclusive and get more landowner level participation at the policy level. So this is us. This is the 5 GSAs. We're calling ourselves the Solano Collaborative. So we have our host tonight, City of Vacaville GSA. Their board of directors is made up of the, Vacaville City Council. We've heard from Curtis tonight. We have other staff here tonight, Justin and Bonnie. We have the Northern Delta GSA. Here are the reclamation districts within the subbasin. Again, there's 10 more that are in other parts of the Delta. Your staff contact there is Eric Ringelberg. We have the Sacramento County GSA. Again, their board of directors is the Sacramento Board of Supervisors. Your staff contact there is Linda Dorn. We have the Solano GSA, which I represent, and again, here are all the various agencies that are part of that GSA. And then you have the Solano Irrigation District GSA. Again, their board of directors are 5 landowners that make up represented parts of the district there, and your contact is their general manager, Carrie Keaton. And then we have a whole bunch of partners, which I'm going to talk about here shortly, that are actually helping us develop the plan. So this is a long planning process. Slow down, sure. A long planning process, a lot of analysis, a lot of data crunching.
Well, I see your hand. We'll take your questions when he finishes, and we'll just do them all together. That's okay?
Doesn't matter to me, we can take questions now.
Let's
Okay, sure. So we are very fortunate that we applied for and were awarded a grant through Proposition 1 that is managed by the California Department of Water Resources, the Sustainable Groundwater Planning Grant Program. The GSAs have been putting up some of their own money for meetings, hiring consultants, putting out materials, and a lot of them continue to collect groundwater data that will help develop the plan itself. This is kind of a complicated slide, but I want to walk through the team that is working on this groundwater sustainability plan. So up at the top, we have the Solano Collaborative, again, the 5 GSAs that are directing kind of the plan. And then we've heard from Vicki already. Ludorf and Scalamini is actually the prime consultant working on the plan, and they've got a number of sub-consultants that are helping them in the whole process. So we have Kennedy Jenks Consulting. They're actually putting the document together. We have David's Engineering. They're helping with the water budget and some of the management actions. We have West Jost also helping with project support and management actions. And then we have ERA. They're going to be looking at some of the economics and feasibility of certain aspects of the plan, and maybe diving a little bit deeper to see if there's ways we can make things a little more flexible. So if there's some interest from stakeholders, do we want to develop a water market? So if landowners want to fallow a field one year, they may be able to sell their water to their neighbor or someone else in the subbasin. So we're trying to make the plan as flexible as possible. And then we have more partners. You've heard from, go ahead.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. You've heard from Joseph already. Ag Innovations is not only providing facilitation support services, they're also helping with overall education and outreach of the plan. And then Freshwater Trust, we have representatives from them tonight. They are also helping with outreach and education for some of our underrepresented communities. And they're working on a tool called Basin Scout. This is a tool that will help landowners optimize their irrigation practices. You can put in different crop types and figure out how much water needs to be applied. So again, we're trying to help you with flexibility. As Vicki mentioned, we're not going to drop a 1,000-page document on you. We're going to give you a section at a time to make it easy to digest, and we're going to hope that we get comments from you to let us know if we're going in the right direction. We don't want to just keep going forward. We want to hear back from you and incorporate your comments and show you what we're putting forward, and want to hear from you if we're going in the right direction. Because as Joseph mentioned, this is a plan to protect our groundwater resources so we can continue with the great agricultural conditions and practices that have been going on for centuries here in Solano County. We have some major check-in points, as Joseph mentioned, some big workshops that are going to be coming up when we get to big sections like our water supply and our water budget and our sustainability goals. And then at the end, after we've heard from you and we've put together a complete document, we want to talk to you again to make sure, again, we're in the right place. Joseph mentioned we have this handout. It gives you a little more information on the various parts of the plan. Ludorf has put together this nice graph, so if there are certain aspects that you want to hear about or comment on, this gives you a nice visual of when that will potentially occur. As Joseph mentioned, we have a website up and running, very easy to remember, www.solanogsp.com. As Joseph mentioned, you can sign up for emails. This little widget is on every page. As Joseph mentioned, the survey's back there. It's actually updated on the webpage, so the surveys you can click on right here. They're all anonymous. We can give us more information about your issues or water conditions of where you live to help us round out the picture. All your your contacts are up there on the collaborative tab, all the information about Sigma that we heard tonight and a lot more, a lot of frequently asked questions. Take a look, let us know if we covered everything. We want to make sure that we have enough information on there to help everyone move forward. A much more detailed schedule is up on the website. As we develop plan sections, they'll be put right up on the website, and you'll see as we make changes based off of your comments, how we've addressed those. And for those that do want to get more involved, you can get more involved. There's a Get Involved page, let you know more about upcoming meetings and whatnot. So that's where we're at with the groundwater sustainability agencies. Again, we are very sincere in wanting to state that this is going to be an open and transparent process and a stakeholder-driven process. We don't want to surprise anyone. We want to make sure that we put together a plan that works for you now and works for you in the future so that we can continue, again, with the great agricultural traditions and production that we have here in the Solano Subbasin. Thank you.
That's good, man. We didn't do it for Vicki. We should have done. We'll give Vicki another one, too. Sir, let me go right to you. Do you have any question for us?
I'm looking at this yellow map that you have here, and you had it on the screen earlier, and you show the gray. Am I understanding that the gray is the Solano? It's green up there, but here on it's gray.
Sure, the big green
Okay.
part, right.
Now you have a dark black line that goes around that whole area. Does that follow the county line?
No, it does in certain aspects when you're talking about the north up by Yolo County and a little bit by Yolo County and Sacramento County here, but the Solano Subbasin still does extend into Sacramento County and a little bit into Yolo County. And then on the western portion, it ends generally on the outskirts of Vacaville.
So would you say the city limits of Vacaville?
Yeah, I guess I would defer to the city of Vacaville to see exactly where that line is.
Because there's, well, not only Vacaville, but if you look at this map, there's properties between the county line to the west and to the south that it's in no man's land.
Right, yeah, so one of the things that we heard earlier today is we need to do a better job of putting names on the roads here, and for the scale we have, like say that map back there, we can easily do that and make that available on the website. So for anything that you're talking about that's outside of this line, you're outside of the subbasin.
So what happened?
You're not subject to Sigma at this point. So we're only talking about if you're inside this line for the Solano Subbasin.
Any property.
This is the Fairfield-Sassoon Subbasin. It's a low priority subbasin, not subject to Sigma, not what we're talking about tonight. Does that answer your question?
Well, let's
Make my mind settle.
so tell me what's on your mind now. Are you concerned that you might experience issues with groundwater?
No, I'm concerned with what is up with that ground.
Aha.
What do you expect of that ground?
So let me try again. So Chris, I think the way to think about it is the dark black lines here is the boundary that this groundwater sustainability plan applies to. If you're outside of that boundary, there's two things that could happen. One, you're in another basin that's required to comply with Sigma. So for for our neighbors to the east that are in the Sacramento region, they'll be in another GSP and another part of another GSA, right? Those guys will be there. But if you happen to be in Vallejo, for example, completely different subbasin and is not currently subject to any of the regulations or any of the activities under the Act. Not currently, at least. Same thing with this area here that's out past Travis. All of that, simply just not part of the Act. You're not subject to it. No fees, no actions, no restrictions, nothing that shows up in this plan applies to properties in those areas.
Why is that? Because Fairfield has all of Sassoon Valley. It's all ag and all using water.
It's a different subbasin, different geology, and it's based off of Bulletin 118, which the Department of Water Resources puts out, that describes the various subbasins. And as Vicki mentioned, some of it had to do with hydrology, some of it had to do with geopolitical positioning. That's just the way it kind of broke out for Solano County.
Sir. We're recording, so I want to just make sure you...
Yeah. Chris, I'm curious, could you talk a little more about the irregular nature of the SID space on the map? And why all the little squares and chunks, if we're all connected underground by water, why would SID's reach be so irregular?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and I don't want to speak too much for SID, but it has a lot to do with how the district was originally drawn out and whether or not landowners bought into the surface water supply that the Solano Irrigation District supplied. Now, they've done a number of annexations over the years. Some of them, for the most part, have touched on the existing boundaries. Some have jumped a little bit. So that's about the extent of how I can answer that question, Herb.
It's a great question. It raises something up that's important, though. Even though that represents the boundaries of the district, SID is required to work with all of the other GSAs to come up with a plan or a coordinated agreement about sharing the management of groundwater throughout the entire subbasin. So they have land use authority or certain additional powers as a result of, not land use, but not so much.
They have water management.
Water management authorities in their basin, but they're obligated to be part of the whole thing. Sir.
SID, if I understand correctly, SID buys water, they sell water, they pump water. So they have, as far as I'm concerned, they need to be water neutral, groundwater neutral in the end.
Yeah, again, we're in the infancy of how we are developing this plan, and we are open to any and all suggestions from landowners on the direction we need to go. What we're trying to do is protect the resource so that we can continue with the irrigation, the farming, the ranching that's going on today and in the future.
Sir.
So Main Prairie Water District, yes, they are part of the Solano Subbasin. No, Main Prairie Water District is in the Solano Subbasin GSA.
Like surface water, you have water rights, priorities. Is there going to be anything similar for whoever had a well in first and has a history? Is a history going to make any difference?
Sure, yeah. So the question really was centered around water rights. And so what we're doing, what we're trying to move forward on is not to upset any existing water rights. And so we're going to be moving our plan, working our plan around that. There are certain water rights, pre-1914, post-1914, all kinds of different water rights, and Sigma does not change any of that law.
Yeah, well, let's talk about priorities on ground.
Okay, so no, we are not currently contemplating anything like that. But maybe that's something that we should. So we'll take that suggestion.
So every acre gets an allotment?
That we will be talking about. So when we talk about sustainability yield, we'll be looking at the subbasin as a whole, and then some of the individual GSA areas if we need to break out an allotment. We want to make sure that the resource is sustainably managed now and into the future. So we might come up with a sustainability goal or sustainability yield that talks about a certain amount of groundwater that can be extracted per acre in the subbasin.
Hey, Chris, why don't you go back to the slide with the stars on it, because I think we can answer this question in a good way, because I think the answer is we don't know. We don't know, and that's the honest to goodness answer, and the only one we really can give you, because until we get to that first star where we're actually beginning to get some water budget information and we understand a little bit more where the county really is, we don't know what we might even have to think about. And so one of our first jobs is to bring that number back to you and ask you, did we do a good job putting it together? Are we missing something? I'll come to you in just a second. What is a water budget? That's a great question. Chris?
Sure, and I'm going to defer to Vicki on this quite a bit, but just from a complete layperson's perspective, which for water budget would be me, is the amount of water coming into the subbasin and the amount of water leaving the subbasin. What we have in, can we take out that doesn't affect what's leaving?
It's best to think about it almost like a bathtub. Water in, water out, same level as the rough goal. And that's what, if you remember that slide Vicki had that had the MT and the MO, that's what she meant. That's like water staying within the proper level inside the bathtub.
And Vicki has a slide when she starts talking about groundwater that shows some of the monitoring we're doing for the subbasin in certain wells, and she'll talk about that.
But let me come back to just finish my answer to you, because we've got this whole question, where are we? And that's that water budget. That gives us a sense of what's up. And then we'll go a little bit farther than that. Like, what are our sustainability goals? Where are we seeing maybe problems? And then we ask the question, what are the projects and management actions we take? And it wouldn't be until we got into that we would even talk about, well, do we have to do an allocation scheme, or do we bring new water into the system, or do we do recharge, or whatever it may be? And so there's a little bit of progression. And I want to be clear, Chris said it was a stakeholder-driven process, and it is, but the front end of this is a lot of science. So we want to make sure that we're working from good science. Now, we got a nice little queue of people who want to ask questions, so I want to go to Dennis first, and then to you, ma'am, and then I'll go over to you, Matt. Dennis.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering, when you refer to groundwater, are you talking mainly about the Tehama Aquifer, the deep water, down 300 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet, and greater, or are you going to include the upper aquifer that starts at about 8 feet east of Leisure-Town Road and around that area, and goes down about, sometimes 50 feet to 100 feet?
Yeah, actually, sometimes it goes down to about 400 feet. Yeah, we're going to talk about all of that, and that's one of the things that we need to spend a little more time on the analysis. Is there any interaction between that upper Puda fan and the deeper Tehama Formation? And Vicki's going to talk about that quite a bit.
Great.
And she's got some great slides to illustrate that.
The simple way to think about it is, if it's in the ground, it's part of the plan.
My question is, how is development in the area coming into play in this plan? Because I don't see anything about the growth. And right now, in rural Vacaville, I know of several development plans. Development for Green Tree, to develop that and put mega homes, thousands of homes over on North Orchard, where it used to be Aliki. They want 1,100 homes there. We have property out in English Hills. They want to put 110 homes in the rural area, which all would have the possibility of groundwater use. So I don't see anything about that in here. How is that going to come into play? Because we have a lot of growth coming to Vacaville.
No, and it's a great question, yeah. And so that's a question that we've heard quite frequently. How does this affect the landowner that's using domestic well? How does it affect me if I'm next to an agricultural user that has a deeper well that may be drying me up? And that's something we absolutely have to put in this plan, and how we're going to look at that and address that. And that's one of the questions that we just don't have quite the answer yet. That's something we certainly need to talk about.
Well, the one thing about that is it's happening now.
That's right.
So how are you planning for what's happening now that's going to affect the groundwater now?
Sure. Yeah, I'll let Vicki take that one.
We're going to talk more about the water budget in the coming slides, but the important thing to your question is the plan requirements also require a 50-year projection into the future. So that includes looking at population growth and water supply requirements during all kinds of water year types, whether it's wet or dry or average. And so it would be looking to what kinds of developments might be already approved and planned, or what else might occur.
So there'll be nothing done to look at it for the current developments that are trying to be in the works now, which brings in thousands of homes. But we're going to look into the future. So the effect is now. It's not 20 years. By then, it may all be gone.
So there are other regulations that require looking at those kinds of things. So on a certain magnitude of a project, it requires a water supply assessment, and there needs to be a demonstration of water supply sufficiency to support that project for at least 20 years. And that is a part of a CEQA process. So it's independent of what we would be doing, but there are other controls to look at that kind of development.
So let me go back to you, sir.
Piggybacking on what this gentleman was talking about, I think what he was getting at was with surface water users, they have rights dating back however long that protect their water usage as far as, somebody else can't come in and just start using all that water, they would have to purchase it or whatnot. Is there going to be any deference given to groundwater users that have had more historical usage of water, or is that going to be something that is discussed, or because groundwater users, we don't have rights dating back that far, but we certainly have precedent. Is that something that's going to be discussed or has already been discussed, or will?
It certainly will be discussed in the plan. Again, SGMA doesn't take away anything from existing water rights, and one of the things that we're going to be looking at in the plan, and Vicki had a slide on this about the undesirable results, is we don't want to do any harm to your neighbor, and so we want to make sure that you have the ability to use the groundwater. Again, we have to look at what the overall sustainability yield is for the entire subbasin, but we will certainly be looking upon that, because we've heard that we've had some wells drying up from here to there, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen as we move forward, but we will absolutely be looking at that.
So, and again, just so you can get in your head, time frame wise, that's likely going to be in this time period next year when we've got some data in front of us, we can start to look at some of the practical things that'll come out of this. Super questions, great questions. Anything else on this section? One more from you, sir, and then I want to go in and talk a little bit about hydrology.
Okay. Most of the land has been, farmland has been developed already, but the cities have deeper wells and use a lot more water per acre than what the farmland does. Are we going to, the farmers going to get gradually squeezed out and water goes to where the money is?
That's actually a pretty good transition. So our next topic is about hydrology, and Vicki actually has a slide that will kind of show where we're at with some monitoring in the wells. Short answer is we're not sure. Right now we can say that's not occurring. We think that the vast majority of groundwater being used right now is for agriculture. The cities do use it to some extent, but it's not even close to the same scale. But we're definitely going to be making sure that we address all those issues. The monitoring that we have in place right now is pretty robust, but it's not perfect. There are some data gaps, and that's something we need to address. And that's something that we're going to be asking maybe some volunteers from some landowners. Can we come and sink our instruments in your well just to see that we have a better picture at some parts of the county where we don't currently collect data, because we don't have the perfect picture. We've got a pretty good picture, but we don't know everything everywhere. But we certainly will be looking towards that.
Excellent. So let's, Vicki's going to come up and talk to us a little bit about water hydrology. Let's let her do her presentation, then we'll come back and we'll have another opportunity for questions. And then we're also going to stick around, all of us who are here, part of the technical team and support. So if for some reason you don't get your question answered during the open period, or you'd rather just talk to us directly, you can also do that tonight. And if you've got things that come up that you're concerned about and you want to just make sure they're in writing and in the record, make sure they're on this yellow sheet of paper, and they'll be in writing and on the record. So, Vicki, let's go through hydrology, and let's be a little mindful that we're not keeping too late tonight.
Thank you, Joseph. So we're just going to hit some highlights of some groundwater concepts and terms, because there are a lot of things that we're talking about with respect to the groundwater system, so there's some understanding, and when we come back, we'll continue to talk about these. So this is just a first touch. So this is general hydrologic cycle, where the water goes on the earth. This is an interesting schematic that was developed by the U.S. Geological Survey, and it's used everywhere in the world in over 60 languages. So what it shows is the natural system, and you might notice there's no wells in this picture, there's no man-made anything. So it's just trying to illustrate what goes on with precipitation that falls on the land surface, runs off, evaporates, discharges, to the ocean, percolates into the subsurface. Once in the subsurface, it can go to groundwater. That groundwater eventually can discharge into streams, into springs and seeps, and make its way out to the ocean. And then we have a different view. This is more of a modern-day view of a hydrologic cycle, where we start to look at those things that can also be inflow into our groundwater system or discharge or removal out of the system. So here we're showing groundwater wells and here and how we can extract groundwater. There might be ponds, man-made structures, evaporation of the water into the atmosphere, drains to remove shallow groundwater, move it around the system. So there are other ways that we influence how water goes into and out of the groundwater system. So there was the question about the water budget. So we refer to that either as a water budget or water balance, and in any case, if you think about it as a bank account. So we're looking at water coming into the system, the inflows into the system, so inflow in the subsurface or inflow along the stream system and then infiltration through the stream channel, water that's applied, agriculture or elsewise, anything coming into the system. We're also wanting to look at what is going out of the system through pumping or evapotranspiration or in the subsurface out of the system. So back to the bank account, what is coming into that account, what is being removed from that account, and what is the balance? What do we have in reserve, and how is that reserve affected by drier years or wetter years? And overall, what we're looking for is that change in storage. We're looking for that change in our account, the change in the amount of groundwater in storage, and that we're always looking for, in the long term, a balance. We're looking for something that isn't going into a deficit, that we're constantly removing more than we're putting into that account. So we touched on this earlier, and I think there was a question. We're not only talking about, well, there's terms. There's groundwater is referring to all of the saturated surface and the subsurface, and aquifer is more specifically that portion of the groundwater system that would be developed with a water supply well and then pumped for beneficial use. Water wells, this could be water supply wells, domestic wells, municipal wells, industrial wells, many types, many sizes, many varieties, many kinds of materials, many depths. There are a few key features to wells, and they might be for production, or as Chris mentioned, there are a lot of wells that are used in the Solano Subbasin for monitoring. And it typically consists of casing material that is installed after the borehole is drilled. There's that casing material is often has screen sections, and those screen sections are placed adjacent to more permeable materials, gravels and sands. And there's also what's known as a filter pack or gravel envelope that's placed on the exterior outside of the casing material and between the extent of the borehole and the casing. And that material acts to filter and ensure that the water drawn in from the groundwater system, that acts to filter out fine materials so that it's clean water once it's pumped to the land surface. And then another very important part is the seal at the top of the well that helps prevent contamination from entering from near the land surface. And sometimes there are seals placed lower down in the well, particularly if there's different things that we want to protect the well from and the water quality from. So this image is to explain some things about how groundwater can occur in different settings. And it can occur under unconfined conditions, which means that this aquifer material, these sands and gravels, they are not overlain by low permeability material, that the water surface of that groundwater system is at atmospheric pressure at its surface. There's also the confined type of aquifer system where it is overlain by lower permeability material materials like clays, and that creates a pressure on that system. And in that case, you often have the water level, actually the pressure in that well, creating a rise in the water level above the level of the aquifer. So these two wells that are schematically shown here, they could be right next to me, completed at different depths, standing where we're at tonight over the different parts of the aquifer system. And in the shallower materials, we have an unconfined system. Much deeper down, it's a confined system, so we can have very different water levels. And in the next slide, I believe, or coming soon, it can be tens of feet different in that water level measurement at the near in space to one another. So it's really important when you hear about domestic wells that might be affected by other wells. It depends on whether or not those wells are near to other wells that are similarly completed. Like if two wells were completed at the same depth horizon as that well, then it can create an interference by each of the other well pumping and affecting the other, but it may not necessarily be due to this deeper well and its effect on the system. Often that may have no effect on the system, or depending upon how much continuity there is between the materials, then it can have an effect. So before we get to that hydrograph that I was just mentioning and the difference in water level measurements, another really important indicator and part of SIGMA is the interconnectedness between surface water and groundwater. So the question was earlier about, are we going to be looking at the shallower part of the system, the groundwater system? Absolutely, because there's connectedness, particularly in the subbasin, between the surface water courses and even sloughs, other water bodies, to the shallow parts of the groundwater system. So this slide and then the next slide are showing just examples of how this connection or disconnection may occur. And it can be across an area in space, or it may be a difference in what occurs in time. So during the summer, sometimes there may be a different condition between the surface water and groundwater than perhaps in the wintertime. So the image on the far left shows how this groundwater body is directly connected to the surface water. And in this case, we have groundwater moving toward the surface water and supplying some portion of the flow to the surface water system. In this case, we have groundwater that's occurring at a lower level than the surface water, and that results in the movement of this surface water going into the groundwater system. It's called a losing stream, where the stream is helping to add recharge to the groundwater body. In this case, we've got a completely disconnected system between the surface water that is not connected at all to the groundwater system. It's allowing for recharge of the groundwater body, but any pumping that would occur in this part of the groundwater system would have no effect on this surface water body because it's not connected. In this other image down here, we're showing how when they are connected, then that pumping, if it's occurring in close proximity or in an aquifer system that has a high permeability and no intervening low permeability materials, then that pumping can result in a depletion of some of the surface water in the stream system. So this is all related to the sustainability indicator that I briefly mentioned before, is we're trying to avoid the withdrawal or pumping of so much groundwater in areas where it would result in significant and unreasonable stream flow depletion. And one of the things that's required in SIGMA and part of the plan is to also map what are referred to as groundwater dependent ecosystems. So that's referring to all of the ecologic communities and species and on the vegetation that relies on and is supported by the groundwater system or the water in the capillaries above the water table itself. This is something that various agencies have done mapping of the vegetative communities, ecologic communities. There's also information that may be developed locally, so that's part of the data that we're trying to acquire from the GSAs so that we have the best information available is what the Department of Water Resources is looking for. And then altogether, we're also trying to establish baseline conditions so that we know what surface water and groundwater connections are occurring, because SGMA does not require you to go back and retroactively restore surface water to pristine conditions, but it wants to ensure that you at least maintain or improve, if that's the will of the stakeholders, the surface water groundwater connection. And then just a couple of real quick slides here to touch on geologic conditions. There's been a lot of work done in the Solano Subbasin, and I know it's a little bit hard to see where all these cross-sections go. These lines are geologic cross-sections such as this. This is one example where we have evaluated the materials in the subsurface to depths of about 2 miles deep. And that's based on evaluation of geophysical logs from oil and gas wells and other drillers' reports, but mostly geophysical logs. These cross-sections extend well into Sacramento County, and to the south, we've taken them down to about, near Walnut Grove, and then about 6 miles south to, northwest of Rio Vista, about 6 miles down in here, so north of Montezuma Hills. And we had the question the other night about any other information that might be looked at down here. We have a lot of boring logs and geophysical logs that we've already looked at, so we'll likely be extending some of the geologic sections down into this area. The other thing that this shows is, just as an example on this one geologic cross-section that extends to, which I can't quite read, but I think it's almost a couple of miles, is that we have an unconfined upper part of the groundwater system, and that includes alluvial deposits and also the upper part of the Tehama Formation that was mentioned. And then there's a middle Tehama Formation, and then the basal Tehama Formation, which is a very productive unit that is tapped by Vacaville for municipal supplies. It's also developed by Dixon Cal Water for some of their supplies. A lot of the agricultural pumping is mostly in the upper part of the system above the basal Tehama, which is at much greater depth. And then I think this last slide, this is just one high-level example of water level trends over time for many decades. And this is illustrating the difference between what we have when we're talking about the upper part of the groundwater system and unconfined conditions. And these two monitoring wells located here near the northeast of Vacaville area, and we're showing how historically, back in 1950 or so, we were seeing a decline in groundwater levels. And then we had in 1959 the onset of the Solano project and recovery of water levels after there was a change in the way water was used, particularly for agriculture. Much more surface water use, and my earlier comments about the importance of being able to use both resources together conjunctively, that has led to this recovery of water levels and stability in those levels over many decades. And so that is the upper part of the groundwater system. And for the most part, when you're talking about SGMA, you're wanting to know the conditions on the overall subbasin. There will be comments. We know that there have been experiences locally of groundwater issues, but those can also be caused by local conditions. So those are what we want to hear about. We want to know, want to be able to track it, what's occurring. But overall, for Sigma, it's about the overall state of the basin. This other plot that we're showing here, this is one example of a well completed in that very deep basal Tehama formation, and this is more of a pressure response. So this is about 60 feet or more deeper than what is occurring at this unconfined part of the aquifer system. And again, it's stable over time, and a lot of that response is due to utilization during drier periods, when surface water wasn't so commonly used. So overall, we're seeing sustainable conditions in the basin. We have seen some of our monitoring wells up in this area with a little bit of trend and decline, particularly during the critical drought period. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Vicki. Let's give her a hand. All right, so now we've had our science presentation. Let's get in. Questions about, was this helpful to get a sense of a little bit of how the hydrology works? It's a little piece of a complex subject. But any questions you have about the way groundwater works as a science or a hydrogeological question?
I just want to know for Solano County, being that we do have some waterways, I just found out in the English Hills area, because that's where I live, that there's English Creek and also Sweeney Creek, but they're not protected because they're private. Well, I was told they're privately owned, but those could help with recharge. And there's also a large pond on the other side of the hill for me, which they say if they develop that land would be not really maintained. So in relation to the groundwater and recharge, how are you addressing that?
It's a great question. I think it's a very local question that I suspect would our friends either from the area or Chris, maybe you can help us. I don't know the specifics of the...
Yeah, and this really is a big question, but I'll take a shot at it, is that we certainly are going to be looking at recharge when we're developing the groundwater sustainability plan, and there are certain portions where recharge makes a lot of sense, and there are other areas where recharge doesn't occur all that much. As Joseph hit when we first started talking about this, we are part of the larger Sacramento River groundwater basin, and we get water coming down from Chico underneath Yolo County all the way and recharging the Solano Subbasin, but we also get recharge locally from rain and from seeping from the Vacaville Hills and from applied water for agriculture in the Solano Subbasin as well. So we will certainly be looking at and targeting management actions, potentially future projects when funding becomes available, and recharge is another way of making sure the stability of our groundwater resources maintain the way we see them for vast portions of the subbasin.
Okay, for some of it, there's soil erosion occurring presently, especially this last year, where the creeks are, and there's no maintenance of it, there's no soil restoration, because it's supposedly owned by the people that own the land.
Yeah, so that's kind of a different issue. That's more of a water quality issue at the surface water interaction there. Again, Vicki touched on this when we're talking about sloughs and creeks that run into the valley portion of the subbasin. We're seeing a little more recharge, but you talk about something like Puda Creek, you actually have a mound of groundwater that's underneath the channel, and it actually dives down really quick. So depending on where you're at in the subbasin, the interaction of surface water and groundwater varies quite a bit.
To add on to what Chris was commenting about recharge, there are a couple of things that we'd be looking at. One is mapping of potential recharge across the subbasin, but there's also tools that we use to do these water budget analyses, and also to look at the entire system, and particularly because we need to look at the 50-year scenario under different kinds of hydrologic conditions. We will be looking also at water coming in from outside of the subbasin, including mountain front recharge. And so even in those areas that are outside the specific basin boundary, we would be looking at contributions external to the basin coming into the basin. And then back in about 2010, the DWR and the SCWA had used a grant funds to look at recharge into the area, and that involved looking at some of the response of the basal Tehama Formation, which is likely from many, many miles outside of the subbasin. I don't know about as far as Chico, but one of the things that would be looked at with a modeling tool are all the inflows, outflows at the basin boundaries from the adjoining areas, and to look at, what are the time delays in terms of receiving water to replenish those systems.
That's great. Let's have some other questions, too. I don't want to stop right here.
I just wanted to touch on one thing that Vicki brought up and just explore it a little bit more, is that we absolutely are going to be talking to our neighboring basins to make sure that what they're doing for their management plan for groundwater resources and what we're doing here locally don't conflict. We don't want to make sure that they're doing something that will negatively impact our subbasin and vice versa. And we've been having those conversations, obviously, with Sacramento and Yolo County for several years now.
That's great. Ma'am, please.
Kind of on a small scale, but this lady was talking about all the new growth coming in back.
I don't want to scare you, but I want them to hear you.
So we have a lot of new growth coming into Vacaville. We have the little farm down Leaky Village or whatever it is, the little old farm, and then some other stuff out in the English Hills area and Leisure Town, all those houses. So in the big general plan, this is kind of a city question because I'm on the outside of that out in the country, and I don't get a say in the city, but they always talk about at the city council meeting about the general plan and how wonderful our general plan is and how perfect it is and it's beautiful and on and on. But in all the new development, all the little pictures that I saw out there for Leisure Town, I didn't see any water conservation, any solar mandatory roofs or anything like that. So in a plan that's as broad as this, would you actually consider some things that would require maybe us to make some lifestyle changes but help the environment, the water, and everything else that's coming forth? Is that part of this plan, or are we just talking about aquifers and creeks and streams?
It is going to be more concentrating on the management of the groundwater resources. That doesn't mean that we won't take your comments and consider them and figure out how they can be best relayed to other planning efforts that they fit more accordingly to. So a general plan for a city, it's California law. They are required to make sure they have a water source before those houses can be built. So that absolutely has to be taken care of. So City of Vacaville has to make sure that through their various water sources, they have that water available for any new houses coming in within the sphere of influence of the city.
And because they're part of this GSP collaborative, the plans that they develop for managing water in their area has to lead to a sustainable outcome for everybody, which means in the way that, this is so funny the way they did it. We think about sustainable being good. It's known in terms of the 6 things that are bad. So we can't have a decrease in the quality of, I'm going to use a term and I want to break it down, groundwater dependent ecosystem. That just means that water on the surface goes underground, water underground comes to the surface, and it supports life, trees, vegetation in that area. And so we have to come up with plans that make sure that those groundwater dependent ecosystems have water, that we can't drain the aquifer so that other people can't have wells. We can't decrease the water quality by concentrating, for example, pollutants that might be in the groundwater. So the City of Vacaville as a GSA, the SID as a water manager, SQUA as a water manager, all the different players have under law an obligation to make sure that we, in the way that we use groundwater, do not create negative future for you, your children, and your children's children. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover every single thing that might be important to build a Solano County that you want to live in the next 100 years, but it's a big chunk of it, and it's a solid chunk of it. And getting it right here, particularly having you be involved in it, proving that we as a community can come together and solve some of these harder problems together, that's a big chunk of the work that has to be done as we grapple with California's need to grow and live within our resources. So it's not a perfect answer, but it's the best one we have for you tonight. Other questions? Sir, let me go to you, Dennis, and then over to you, Matt, please. And we just did this so we can hear you all and get a report.
Yeah, just something to tie a little bit in with your question is the city, as the city of Vacaville wants to expand east of Leisure Town Road, those are flood areas, flood zones. And in order to deal with the runoff, the stormwater runoff, their recent residential build out there by Elmira, they built a stormwater retention basin. In order to do that, they dug down about 7 feet and they hit water and they couldn't go any further. So they dug down another, so they put in wells all around it, 100, pumped them all to drain, and then got their equipment in there and dug really quickly to get down another 8 or 10 feet. And then they pulled their equipment out, removed all the wells, and then the groundwater flooded back in. And so there's a lake out there it's a perennial lake. It's this, you can go out there any time of the year and it's got 8 feet of water in it. And so it's basically just a well with a borehole that's about 5 acres around or better. So when the stormwater runs in there, from the surface, it's 8 feet below, right? So hydraulically, you're going to put more pressure over that aquifer. So the stormwater that runs in there that's taking everything off the rooftops and roadways and lawns and everything else goes in there, creates pressure over that aquifer and pushes down. So it's going to bleed it back in to the aquifer. And I have no knowledge of anybody putting in piezometers around there or putting in any kind of system to detect pollutants. And when they were discussing the 6,000 home build out on that side, they were going to do 2 more of these things and have 3 in total, I guess, about 3. And so when you talk about groundwater, and there's everybody that I live in this area out there where everybody has a shallow well. They're only about 40 feet deep to maybe 60 feet deep. And so that groundwater, so that's a direct recharge from runoff. So how are you going to deal with something like that with a community that wants to build out? Vacaville is probably not the only one that's going to be doing these things.
Yeah, that's one of the things we're going to have to address, and what we're going to be doing as we move forward and looking at issues and concerns that need to be addressed like that. We'll come up with management actions, and whether it be some way of redirecting that standing water into a better area to recharge the subbasin, that would be a positive benefit to the recharge of the subbasin. So there'll be things that we'll have to look at a local level, things we'll have to look at the entire subbasin level, and at each of the GSA levels to put together management actions, again, to make sure that conditions are where they need to be for wherever you're at in the subbasin. So I don't have a real direct answer for that, but that's the direction we're going.
So I'm not familiar with the project, but it just says to me that it's a very full basin. And so it will be helpful to understand, across the subbasin where there's opportunities for the subsurface to actually receive that surplus stormwater to be able to better utilize it, for recharge, rather than being so full, there's really no storage space to receive that recharge.
Yeah, it's great. It's a wonderful question, and it takes us right into the complexity of it. So, Matt, you've got a comment question.
Yeah, kind of everybody's talking about, and two to go together, talking about expansion and subdivisions. If the city of Vacaville wants to annex part of the county land and expand, put in subdivisions, do they automatically cut into that GSA and expand their territory? And if 2 GSAs disagree, say something like that were to occur, and we have a X number of acre feet that the subbasin is allotted, and the Solano subbasin says, hey, we want this much for agriculture, and Vacaville says, hey, we're going to annex this and put this in for development, we need this water. Who wins? How do you decide? Is there a vote between the 5 subbasin GSAs? How does that work?
Right now, we are working through consensus building at the staff level. We are drafting a memorandum of understanding on what our governance structure is actually going to look like amongst those 5 GSAs. We're not quite there yet. It's something we're going to be working on probably for the better part of this year and maybe even into next year to figure out what our working relationships are going to be as we move towards the implementation phase of this GSP. So we anticipate that we're going to have an MOU that talks exactly about that. When you have issues amongst a GSA or amongst multiple GSAs, how do you deal with that? And so we're not quite there yet. Again, we're hoping that through the good work that we've started, we can work our way through those issues, but we certainly need to have some governance structure in place when we get to those hard decisions on how to figure it out.
That's great. Matt, I also just want to be clear. The law says you will comply with SGMA. And if the GSAs aren't able to solve it between themselves, the default is that the state steps in and solves it. And there's 2 ways that can be solved. It could force a plan, or you could be forced into adjudicating groundwater use. Both of them pretty unpalatable. And my sense of it from working in Solano County for a long time is that that's not what's going to happen here. That the problem that you're talking about is going to be, there's going to be a venue and a mechanism for working it out. But it has to be robust enough to handle the situation that Dennis brings up or you've spoken about, ma'am. And that's why we need you to be part of the process. This is going to think about the coordination that's going on here. For the first time in Solano County, we're trying to figure out how to manage a resource that before 2014, right, was not legally managed, and yet all of us depended on it and shared it. It's a heavy lift. It's a big thing. And so in order to do it right, in order to make sure it's fair, in order to make sure that well users have their needs met, that communities have their needs met, that the environment has their needs met, and particularly communities that don't show up at meetings like this have their needs met, right? Because there's lots of your neighbors that never come to a meeting like this but might be worried, right? That we actually have to have you guys hold all of us, the cities, the water agencies, the people working on the plan to account. And that's the way we'll get a great plan for the county. And the only way I know to deal with something as complex as what you described, Matt. Please, Eric.
The problem's a lot more acute down in the San Joaquin Valley.
It most certainly is.
Do we have a pattern of fall?
Good. Chris.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So his question was, that there are deeper rooted issues in other parts of the state, and for better or worse, yeah, we're going to learn from their mistakes, learn what they did right. And so as Vicki mentioned, they're critically overdrafted basins. They actually have to submit their GSPs to DWR by January 1st of next year. We have 3 more years to figure it out. So we're going to see the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we're going to try to take the good of what we see coming up in front of us.
Thanks, Chris. Please.
Hi, I have another question. So I am on a well on my property. I'm on rural North Vacaville. And one of the things that is there is the rural North Vacaville Water District. My question is related to the fact that the wells have arsenic and hydrovalent chromium. And the arsenic is caused one of the wells to be shut down because they can't mitigate it because it's above the level allowed. And the second well is almost to that same level. So they're talking about bringing in some sort of material that would absorb it, but they have no explanation where that material then would end up once it's fully contaminated with arsenic. They have not addressed the hydrovalent chromium, which I understand is in most of California's well waters, and that they just changed the parts per billion allowed and lowered it. So how does that interplay with all this groundwater? Because we're all in the same type of subsoil.
Yeah, no, excellent question. And it's one of the 6 things that we have to account for. Undesirable results is degradation of water quality. So absolutely, we have to address that in the plan.
So,
Yes.
plan, but
Well, I can't give you specific questions on your well right now. We're not quite there yet. That's a pretty specific question. We're going to try to address it at a subbasin level, then a GSA level, and if we're not hitting it at your local level, then we need to talk and figure that out. And unfortunately, North Vacaville Water, they're not part of this plan, but SID is acting on their behalf. So SID is part of this process, and we'll get to your answer hopefully before we're at the end of the plan.
thank you.
So we've done annual reports for Solano County Water Agency and other work in the Solano Subbasin, and it's naturally occurring, arsenic and hexavalent chromium, and like you said, it's much more common for the hexavalent chromium throughout the state than anybody ever thought 10 years or more ago. They thought it was kind of rare, but it's not. And so SGMA doesn't require that you retrofit naturally occurrence. So that's more of how to deal with where the water supply is developed from.
Great question, and thank you for bringing the hard ones, because we'll have to grapple with them. Now, we're getting near to the end of the evening. I don't want to leave anything out. I do want to say we're all going to stick around and be here for more one-on-one questions to the extent that we're able, but I do want to just tell you what's coming next. So remember that slide I showed you that had the 5 stars on it? Go back and look at the slide deck on this online. Check those stars. Those are the next times we're going to be in front of you. And in our next meetings, we're not going to be doing, lots and lots of presentations. We're going to share some information with you, and we're going to sit around a table, and we're going to work together on it. And we'll get your input. It'll be a very workshop style. In all of our public engagement, our goal is to make it possible for you to attend. So tonight, we had available childcare. So if you've got friends that have young children it's hard for them to come to meetings, let them know that service is going to be available for them. And we also have translation. So we're also, I want to bring back my friend and colleague Emily Finnegan to talk a little bit about some of the special things we're going to do to reach people that sometimes we don't hear from enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. Hello again. So my organization, which again is the Local Government Commission, we are working with another local nonprofit, the Freshwater Trust, to bring some of these conversations to your local community groups. We want to hear from you, and we want to perhaps have some smaller conversations as kind of a separate project working within this subbasin. So if you are a member of a Rotary Club or a faith-based organization and you would love to have some education and outreach, some of that outreach that Chris had mentioned earlier, we would love to kind of bring these conversations at that level and kind of hear a little bit more about what your concerns and questions may be, and of course bring that back to the outreach and engagement team. So if you would love to have us come to one of your groups, please feel free to come up to me at the end of this meeting, and I would love to get your information. Thank you.
I just want to underscore again, one of the things that you'd like to think that we've learned things over the years, right? And so one of the things in SGMA that's very different than other things that have come out from the state of California is the requirement that we work with you meaningfully as stakeholders, and we mean it. So when Emily says, do you have a group that maybe doesn't come to meetings but would love to know more about it, we mean it. We'll go out there and we'll talk to them about this project. So please, if you want to hear more about us, be on our mailing list. That's the #1 way we're going to be informing you. You can get on the list by filling out making sure that your email address is legible on the sign-in sheets. My friend and colleague Susanna Sossman in the back, actually is a real human being, types those in and makes sure that they work. So if you don't want to hear from us, misspell your email and you'll never get it. But I hope you'll give us that information. do fill in the surveys and share with us any other details that you may be able to. We're going to stick around a little bit and be available for any other one-on-one questions you may have. But I just want to leave you with one thought. This is a complex process, and no process like this is perfect. But I know from working with the people that are part of this, every single GSA that's here, whether it's a single entity or a multiple entity, all of the technical staff, all of the staff working on community engagement, and all of the stakeholders that we've talked to, every one of us cares that a good outcome from this plan happens for the Solano Subbasin. And there's only one way we get that good outcome, and that's for you to be part of it. So I do hope that I see you again at future public input meetings, that you do share with us honestly the challenges and the opportunities and your good ideas on how to solve problems in the county, and that you make this reflect the best of what's possible in the Solano Subbasin. And with that, I want to thank you and thank all of the team that put this together. Wish you well. We're here for additional questions, and take care.